George, Yvette, thank you so much for coming on the show. Welcome to B2B Podcast Stories. You both have really interesting podcasts, and you're both either veterans or current players in the Payments on Fire podcast, which is huge in the payment space, which is an interesting niche to have a huge podcast in, but we'll delve into that in a second. But George, you're the one that started Payments on Fire, right? Way back when. So,
I am.
where did that come from? Why did you start Payments on Fire for Glennbrook Partners? You stated when we talked earlier that it was called your college radio station.
One of my partners decided to mock me and mock the effort. But it was actually, I just went back and looked, and it was 9 years ago when we started it. And podcasting had been around for some time, but it was starting to get credence and traction in the business space. And besides, I thought it would be fun and creative to do it. And those are important, values for me. It also struck me to be really congruent with how Glenbrook does its business. Glenbrook, as a payments consultancy, has always had a very strong educational component. In fact, it's a pretty big line of business for Glenbrook that Yvette's part of that team, and I was too at the time. And Glenbrook had actually, prior to that, for years been running the very first blog called Payments News, where we were taking the news of the payments industry and posting that every day. And, as consultants who need to be trusted and regarded, we never took advertising for Payments News. We never took any sponsorship for Payments on Fire right from the get-go. It was all about what's right for the industry. What does the industry need to be thinking about? And so we decided that let's go out and just have interesting conversations with payments geeks. And, I just took a look at some of the titles of the very early podcasts from 9 years ago. And Yvette, they'd make me laugh because I got it. Like, faster payments, crypto, authorization rates.
9 years ago, you were talking about crypto?
Apple Pay.
The first podcast, George. Tell them what the first Payments on Fire podcast was.
No, it was on Bitcoin with one of our founding partners, Scott.
It was on Bitcoin. They had just come back from a conference, right? Some conference that you were in, and George is interviewing him, and it's all about what people were thinking about back then. We actually just released it in a From the Vault episode.
Wow. And so, how has it matured well? Just
It kind of has, because these topics, they evolve
a lot, right?
It's an evolution, and there's certain ones that come up that are just perennial favorites. But I think, George, why did you guys choose that particular podcast? Do you remember, to be the first one? Was it like everybody's talking about Bitcoin?
Well,
so we have
it was everybody's talking about Bitcoin, and Scott had direct experience with virtual currencies. So he was a perfect person from the legitimate payments industry to address this new phenomenon that Bitcoin was at the time. So,
and just to be clear, it wasn't because he was put in jail for dealing with them, right? He had legitimate.
Right.
People don't know this. Like there were attempts. I won't call it crypto. There were attempts at digital currency, virtual currencies, well before Bitcoin came onto the scene, and a lot of those people were indicted. And ended up in jail. So it's kind of funny, but no, he wasn't one of them.
Your podcast matured well then. If okay, as long as that didn't happen, then you're good. Okay.
But it really, and Yvette, you need to speak to this, but I think within fairly short order, it really found itself underneath our educational mission. And I had some funny experiences. I'd be at a conference talking with someone, and someone else would walk by and go, stop, and go, I've heard your voice. Did you do Payments on Fire? Yeah, and that was very gratifying just because people were listening and finding these conversations to be beneficial, to be useful.
Mm-hmm.
So on that point about, like, you did an episode on Bitcoin 9 years ago. So that's what, 2014? 2014. Okay, my math is still good. So that's really early. So that's before, I guess it was a thing. The white paper was published. It was out, but the crypto bubble hadn't happened yet. The huge get rich quick scheme hadn't happened yet. So I guess it was still a payments niche in a way back then. But at the same time, the long form format of podcasting, that you published something 9 years ago, which is still relevant today, still listened today, and can be repurposed for today. I mean, that's the beauty of podcasting, right? You create something that's really there, and it's such an immersive experience that you're there talking about a topic from 9 years ago, and you can say, hey, look, I was talking about this 9 years ago. In a consulting view, that's really beneficial, right? That you're saying, hey, look, we were ahead of the curve, and now you know what Bitcoin is, but we've been talking about this for 9 years.
Well, as Yvette was saying, that while the topics, the high level labels have stayed pretty consistent, but what we're actually talking about has changed enormously around each of these topics. I mean, we were talking about tokenization 8 and 9 years ago, and I know that you're still talking about tokenization now, but just in a different context.
We we can't stop talking about tokenization, and we want to, but no one will let us stop talking about it. The thing is there's this. I think what you're touching on is really interesting, because perennial topics and education is about having context, and in payments and in a lot of industries, you think biomedical, you think a lot of different industries out there today, things are changing really, really fast. How do you keep up and learn in an environment that's changing under your feet all the time as a professional? And you do that when you have context, right? You weren't there. There's a lot of people in payments today that weren't there 9 years ago. But if you can provide them a way to find the context and to derive, why is this important? How is this different today than before or in the past? Or what's been going on in this space? Then you're giving them something that they can't get out of a news article per se in the moment in time. They can't get it from reading the tech spec for the dev guide for whatever they're trying to do. And you can't really get it out of a lot of the papers that are out there even. The papers might give you a sense of what was going on, but they're not going to kind of give you that full context. So we're really trying to curate, to George's credit, we're trying to curate an environment where people can come and find out things and hear a little bit of that historic, you can eavesdrop in on what was going on. You can actually hear Scott talking about what happened at a conference 9 years ago that does have relevance, even if it's changed. Knowing that context is so important to people because they can learn faster, they can come up to speed faster, they can make better decisions with context. And we're really we're super passionate about educating the industry. We've had, at Glenbrook, we've had over, I've lost count. I think it's now this year, it's going to be like 33 or 34,000 people go through one of our education workshops. And about that many have bought the book that Carol and others collaborated on years ago. And, we're getting ready to rewrite that again. So it's one of those things where the context sets the table for people. And we just don't see a lot of opportunity, other groups taking the opportunity to do that. So that's one of the things that we try to do.
And one of the things I loved about doing the podcast and still enjoy listening with Yvette and and a new podcast we've started producing is the opportunity in a conversation to have a question that wasn't in the script, and I'm putting that in air quotes, because whatever the guest may have said sparks a new thought, and you get to run down that track. And that's I know I'm not so unique that and interesting that if I have a thought that someone else hasn't had the same thought who is listening. So so we really get to expand that context in a way that ends up being a lot deeper than what you, to your point of that, about what you may come away with from reading a white paper, for example.
Talking about that, sparking additional thoughts, George, how do you, so it's very interesting that now we look back at topics you've talked about 9 years ago, and I was scrolling through some of your episodes when you did quite a few on Apple Podcast and Apple Pay, not Apple Podcast, obviously. That's typically a title that could still be quite successful today, because digital wallets are all the hype also for corporates and so on. Mm-hmm. Podcast as a media would be, okay, we try to do long format, eventually insightful conversations, eventually evergreen content. But on the other hand, when you're focusing on thought leadership, you need to be topical, right? You need to be seen as expert. Experts have the latest insights and already know what's coming. So how do you balance this when you start a podcast that aims at showing yourself as thought leaders on the industry, but also discussing insights and providing value, whilst balancing this with evergreen content that you want people to be able to go back 9 years ago, which is quite a thing actually, and say, oh, well, back then they were talking about this and it's still relevant. How do you balance that?
It's not easy. We actually, I don't know how George, I can say how I'm doing it now, but George, how did you do it first? Like, how did you decide?
Honestly, I wasn't very sophisticated. I was sort of following my nose in terms of what is getting a lot of discussion right now. What's creating the most, the biggest question stream. And out of that, to your point, some topics are very of the minute, right? Mm-hmm. And they need to be addressed. But others, we had questions about, how does settlement actually take place? How does money move between bank accounts? We did a podcast with one of Glenbrooks' founders, Karen Coy Benson, who's an expert on settlement. And I don't have the ability to look anymore, but I'll bet you that's still in the top 3, if not the number one.
It's still in the top 3 or the top 5. We try to do a little post every year of like what's on the leaderboard, and she's still up there, if not number 1 position. She's up there. But to your point, we had one with Steve Klebe, who's been in the payments industry for, I think, since he was born. And
just does.
He came out. He had credit cards. But when he did one with us on Google Pay, which was very topical. Mm-hmm. It was topical because Google was doing some really interesting work at that point. But it was also topical because he was explaining how they did it. And so but the explanation, even though it was new at the time, it still holds. The novel thing that they did still holds, right? So that was really kind of an interesting one that we fell into, something that was like topical and continuing education. So sometimes, like George, it just happens. When I'm doing the quote unquote script and the write-up that goes with the script and the show notes, I try to set a context so that every episode now has some background in it deliberately.
Awesome.
And that preamble is for the new listener or the listener who's in payments for years but has never heard about or talked about this specific topic, which is common. So it gives people a little bit of a, let's just hone in on what we're about to talk about so that you can follow along in the conversation. Right. And then we try to sort of start out with building on that context or bringing in some questions that build on the context. And then we go a little bit deeper. Then we try to double click or let the conversation kind of take its course, right, with the person that we have on. So the guest is driving, but we're guiding, if you think of it that way.
Right.
And that gives them a level of comfort too, that we're teeing up and representing their thought process. And of course, they get to see all that preamble as part of it before we get them actually into a situation where we're recording. So they're pretty comfortable. And then we have a giant disclaimer on that says, these questions may lead us down other paths. Be forewarned. Don't show up if you can't deal with that. Right. So, but no one's ever like ghosted us. So I think we're pretty good.
We put that one in very early.
Yeah.
Nope. Don't be surprised if this goes in a different direction than you anticipated.
So podcasting as a medium really enables all the things that you said there, right? Like it enables the free-flow conversation, which maybe you don't get from writing a blog post or a white paper. It gives you the context. I really like that insight, actually, Yvette, that the context of a conversation and the way you have a conversation, it's almost like a time machine, right? You can go back to 2009 and really feel like you're there and be like, okay, this was really the conversations are happening, or 2014, this was what people were saying about Bitcoin back then, which I guess historians do today with newspaper articles, with things like when we study 1940s and the events that happened in the 20th century. I remember in the history classes, we would be looking at newspaper articles and we'd be looking at these kind of things to understand the context of what people were thinking at the time and everything like that. But podcasting as a medium gives you that context in such a human, innate storytelling format that, sure, reading is incredible human experience, but listening to a conversation or conversations in general. Just do you see that podcasting lends itself as a medium and which provides attributes such as context and whatnot, other than the other forms of content? Because you guys are big on content. You've got the book, you've got the blog post, you've got the newsletter, you've got all these things, but you have the podcast. What does the podcast give as a medium?
So I'll just quickly say that in my experience at Glenbrook, we got a blog called Payments Views. And when we looked at the data, the view, we would put a blog post out there and it would get a great spike for 3 or 5 days but for a podcast, it had tremendous longevity in terms of in every month, it's another 100 downloads, another 100 listens on something that's a year old, 2 years old, which really speaks to that hunger, I think, for context. And it's also got a lot to do with, as you said, the storytelling aspect. And it's also convenient. Believe it or not, I actually can fold laundry and listen to a podcast at the same time.
Exactly. I was going to say, come on. It's like the gym thing. Like you go to the gym, you listen to your podcast, you catch up. You're on, well, when we used to commute a lot, I don't know if everyone's commuting anymore, they are folding laundry or washing the dishes or whatever you're doing. Mm-hmm. It's audio. It's around you. You can do other stuff and still be tuned in, if you will. And I don't think people read as much as they used to, honestly. Yeah. And so I think it's sort of more contemporary with the way people want to absorb information. Convenience is a huge thing. Yeah. We always joke about the gym, your payments on fire at the gym or whatever. Yeah. The other thing that your question brought to mind was we actually have been playing around with a short form called Fanning the Flames that we started as a way to incorporate timeliness or more of a Glenbrook people talking to Glenbrook people, thought leadership kind of cut at things. So, of course, we co-host with each other. I'm the host right now. I'm in the host chair, but we co-host and bring other partners on all the time and other associates. Everyone's fair game to get to pull into a podcast with us. But when we do a Fanning the Flames, the idea is it's just us talking. There's no external guest. And that gives us a little bit of latitude to give opinions a little bit more, or be a little more topical, or talk about what just happened at Money 2020 or some other big conference in the industry. What did we see? What did we observe that was different from last year? What are we keeping an eye on? So that's another thing. You can kind of make a little spin-off brand to, you can't do that in a written format. And it's hard if you try to, I can't even imagine how I would do that in a written format, but it gives you a lot of latitude as a medium to experiment as a creator.
So how do those episodes perform versus the other ones? Are people interested in that versus the other format?
I love our listeners. I'm learning more and more about them. And, we're doing a lot more with metrics on these podcasts. And we've experienced a few aha moments in our metrics over the last year. And one of them is, it doesn't matter what we dish up, they're there for us. They're listening. So a Payments on Fire guest podcast and a Fanning the Flames, Glenbrook talking to Glenbrook kind of conversation are equally great. Like the listenership is there. We also found out we can exhaust our listeners because we upped our production to once a week, and people could not keep up. So we were dropping every Wednesday for most of this year. And I think, George, the prior average was like every 2 to 3 weeks ish, usually every 2. But
yeah, if I got out 2 a month, that was I was doing well.
Yeah. And
it was all handcrafted.
Yeah, you were doing everything, scoop to nuts. But you can kind of exhaust your listeners if you're doing too much content, is what we learned eventually. So we're back to George's prescient twice a month drop, every other week drop schedule. So.
Yeah. Speaking of,
we also have other things to do with it.
A couple.
Eventually. But speaking of co-hosting and exactly what you just mentioned here, so for context for our listeners, George, you started the Payments on Fire podcast, which was also colorfully named College Radio Station, but then handed it over to Yvette. In most companies, what we've seen is that you have, when there is a podcast within that company, there is a podcast champion, and that champion carries the podcast, make sure everything happens, get the post-production done, get the publishing done, and so on. Sometimes that champion leaves the company or is put on another project and the podcast dies out. You have a very interesting story in the sense that, George, you handed it over to Yvette, and Yvette made it a further success than it was even before. How do you make that happening? Like making sure the podcast doesn't die out and finding the right person to hand it over to take it further?
Well, it was I think pretty straightforward in our case. Yvette, my recollection is we had done some podcasts together prior to. I had a health event I had to stop, and Yvette, but we'd worked closely with one another as educators, and as I said, she'd already participated in the podcast, and the mechanics were pretty well laid down, and so it was a pretty seamless transition, and Yvette's just gone from strength to strength with it.
You're too kind. Now it was actually scary being on the other side of that equation, George.
Tell us about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's a little intimidating. I think George had done, hosted and produced 170-ish.
I think that's the right number, something like that.
Podcasts before I showed up. And maybe there was some overlap in there if I was co-hosting with you during that period of time. But picking up at that point with an established audience of listeners who have a set of expectations, as much as I was super excited to be co-hosting with George, and as, glad I was, not glad that you had a health issue, obviously, but happy to help out, I'm glad to help out and keep it going, because it was important to our firm and it was important to our listeners, I think, to keep it going. It's a little intimidating, actually, like picking up the baton. And, we were doing these podcasts at first and then looking at the numbers and being like, are people still going to listen? It was a little scary, right? You don't want to mess up something that somebody's built a legacy into for the firm and for your personal legacy of doing this podcast. I didn't want to be the one that like turned everybody, got everyone to turn the channel. That would have been...
That was something I never thought would happen.
Well, and it was my worst nightmare.
Oh, shoot.
But it's great fun now. It's a great joy. But it was scary at first.
And that's a super interesting point, Yvette. What we've experienced, Hussam and I, with our other podcasts, and we suspect a lot of podcasters who start out that podcast, when you publish the first episode, eventually you know that you will get maybe a few dozens listens. If you do a bit of advertisement around it, you will get a couple hundreds. And then you just keep on publishing consistently, and all of a sudden you have 5,000 downloads a month, even more. And you're like, well, I've been doing it so far, so it's just progressing. I'm happy about it. Taking over from somebody who gets that kind of numbers and even more with Payments on Fire, like dozens, hundreds of thousands of downloads a month. And you're like, I need to take that over and I need to do that right. If we get into the advices for the podcasters out there, what are the things you've put in place? Have you looked at the type of content that was doing well, for instance, and tried to replicate that? Where did you try to implement your own personality, your own questions? Like, what was a bit the reasoning behind it to say, okay, it's scary, but I'm going to make this work?
That's a great question. I think there were certain things that we absolutely wanted to stay true to, right? Mm-hmm. The premise of the podcast, making sure we had a balance. So, we bring in people who are in the industry, and we also bring in people who are new to the industry, startup founders and things like that. And we try to have some variation in the topics. It's a survey, right? So we may over-index a little bit because something's going on in the industry and there's just a whole lot of it, but we can't do a 100% on topic X, right? And if we are going into a topic very deeply, like this past year, we did a lot on fast payment systems and instant payments with FedNow launching and Pix in Brazil skyrocketing, all these things going on in the particular space of payments. But we made sure that we were getting different angles to it, right? So we weren't just saying the same thing with the same type of guest over and over again. And it's interesting because it actually is hard when people write they can email us at paymentsonfire.com and like say, I have a guest idea, or they'll use our info and contact us form and say, I'd like to submit someone as a guest. And they'll say, I just heard so-and-so talking on this topic, and we do that too. And it's like, gee, that's great. So I'm sure you're good at it. But yeah. And so you have to really kind of dig. The other thing that George kind of laid the ground rule that we've definitely kept is you can't turn it into an advertisement about your product. This isn't an infomercial. We'll let people talk about what they're doing, obviously, and a little bit about the product if it's relevant and gives them context to the rest of the conversation. But we really steer clear of promotional advertising, I guess is the way to say it. We, as people in the industry and as consumers, we're inundated with that kind of stuff all the time. This is really about keeping it real and having a conversation. And that, I think, goes back to your point of it that respects the medium. That respects the essence of what a podcast should be. And it's two directional.
And I'd say it's also mapped nicely to the consultancy in that we would have ideas for podcasts come from partners who are working in a different area than I worked in. You know, I did a lot of work in security and in emergent acceptance of payments, but we would speak with folks from Brazil because of Elizabeth McQuarrie's expertise in global payments.
Right.
So to that extent, it was it's a vehicle to showcase the breadth of our knowledge and showcase individual partners and team members. And I make it up, but because I don't know the answer, because we never did take any advertising. But if you start taking advertising, you lose a certain level of freedom, right?
Also, yeah. So that's a really nice transition, because one of the things we wanted to talk about was, I mean, Glennbrook Partners is a payments consultancy. You guys have a business, and you're making, I'm sure, hopefully good money off of that as well. And the podcast, as much as education is incredibly important and you want to do good for the space, and you guys, I'm guessing, bill quite high for your time. So the time that you spend on the podcast, what's the ROI? It doesn't have to be monetary, right? I'm asking for a number specifically. But the ROI on the time that you invest into a podcast, do you see the business benefit come back? Have people said to you, hey, yeah, have you sold consulting services from that? Has it had some form of, you know, like either direct or indirect monetary gain for you?
I think it helps us stay top of mind with the industry. It's an indirect gain. I don't think it's a direct gain. And I don't think it was really meant to be that. And I'm going to come back to that point, because there's something else that's kind of funny about that. Who is it a direct gain for? I want to comment on that. But it's an indirect, and we actually consider it and budget it as part of our marketing spend. So we have education, and the podcast is educational, but for a workshop or for a book, you know, people spend money for those things, right? But for a podcast, a blog post, a payments views post, our news feeds, we don't charge for all those things. So it's considered marketing. And just like any other marketing activity, people try to pin ROI on it all the time. And it's like pinning, you know, it's like nailing Jell-O to a wall. Well, we think this happened, but it's very hard to get a direct correlation. But it's really important, because we think that as much as it helps us stay top of mind for listeners, it also helps listeners stay on top of the industry. And the more informed the industry is about what's going on, the stronger it is. And it really is it sounds a little bit, you know, aspirational. It is aspirational. So it's marketing, but it's also aspirational to make the industry better. And a lot of the consulting firms in this space will focus on a particular segment or a particular form of payment, or, you know, in this very broad and complicated industry we call the payments industry. We kind of work with all parties to help everyone get stronger. So we just have a slightly different philosophy than a lot of folks out there. So it's indirect for us. Interestingly, I have recorded some podcasts, particularly with individuals who are founders of companies. And after they've been on the show, they write me back and they're gobsmacked. They can't believe it, because all of a sudden investors are reaching out to them. All of a sudden there's all this interest in them, right? And we weren't trying to do that, but they just came across so well talking about whatever they were talking about that they suddenly got a lot of interest in their product.
Super interesting.
Their company. And that's happened. I don't know, George, if it happened with you, but it's happened to me now already, like multiple times, where people come back and go, I can't believe what being on your podcast did for our little company. And I thought that was really super cool.
You didn't even ask for founder stock.
I didn't know. There's no there's no direct correlation here, but it has helped, and so that's kind of an interesting something that I didn't expect. And then a lot of times we'll have a guest on, and they'll be like, "I got into the industry reading your book." Or, going to one of your workshops, and here I am. And like now they're like SVP, VP, CEO, founder, CIO, CTO, whatever, of some payments company, 5-10 years later. So that's kind of cool too,
And following up on that, and not to challenge it even, because I really like the spirit and the approach. In the consulting industry in particular, the branding and the personal branding of a partner also makes what the consulting business is about, right? And how successful it could be. By that, I mean, there is a direct correlation between being on top of mind and getting engagements eventually as an indirect effect. But I also like what you mentioned in the sense of getting into rooms that you would have potentially not, but also the people who gravitate around you because of the brand you've created and the thought leadership medium that you've created. When they become those C-suite payment responsible or in fintechs 10 years after, the first person I would think about when they will have to face a payment issue is, Yvette, obviously, is going to be her. And it's a very long-term game, which is what we really appreciated with payments environment and podcast in general. But that's very beneficial ultimately in the overall space, right? On top of the thought leadership aspect.
Yeah, I agree. And, we could take out billboards too, right? Like it does kind of bring that on. But I think what you're touching on is why it's important that we bring in co-hosts, that we do showcase the breadth and the bench strength that we have. Mm-hmm. But it's done from a genuine perspective of wanting to discuss an important topic, right? We could probably have it a lot easier if we did a podcast where we were just sort of letting people show up and say whatever they wanted to say to us, right?
For sure.
And so it takes a lot more effort. So it really is tracked as a marketing cost for us. And my time writing a script up is, like every hour I spend is tracked in our bookkeeping system. We're just not charging any money. So it goes under the marketing budget. And as a firm, right, all of the other partners have to be okay with that, right? So George's radio station, he had to go say, I'm going to start spending time doing this thing. And, and they thankfully let him, right? And agreed as partners.
How did you make that
even though they
George?
kidded him, right? Yeah. How did you make that
business
sale?
case?
How did you convince everyone that was a good idea?
One of the with Glenbrook, because Glenbrook's not a big firm. With Payments on Fire, we now have a bigger voice, which is also helpful competitively because there are monster consultancies out there that we compete with.
How did you tell them? How did you hi, I'm going to do a podcast. And they said, start your own radio station. Yeah.
So Brian didn't make that comment until after I'd gotten a couple of episodes out.
Oh.
But I said where I was going was Glenbrook's a small firm. It's a creative firm. Let's try stuff. And
nice.
So, and it's also the case that the barriers to entry for podcasting are pretty damn low, right? I mean, in terms of the technology and the costs to get up and running and get your what you have to say, get the recording out there. That's pretty inexpensive. It's all that front end work though that Yvette just was talked about, is setting up the context, writing the preamble to the script. That's really focuses everybody. That's critically important, and that's frankly that's where the added value comes in. That's actually why people listen to Payments on Fire.
No,
because it's targeted. There's real information. I was laughing to myself a minute ago, thinking to the 1 or 2 episodes I had where the guest didn't quite get the rule that no, you're not flogging your product here. And actually, I think there were 1 or 2 where I went, I'm not going to publish that.
Wow. Yeah. We do, like, there was one I remember we recorded and we were like, this just doesn't hit for us, right? It just isn't. And it's hard to say, like, please don't ask me like what exactly that criteria is. Like, if you're advertising, we'll either say, hey, wait a second, we're going to just pull that back. But there's sort of a something that we're going after. And we have a lot of latitude to not, because we're not getting paid to do it by an external party. And it is more of our marketing spend. We have the latitude to say, that's not how we want to show up. And that freedom is really, really important to us.
Authenticity. I really like that.
Yeah.
No, interesting indeed.
Payments is super complicated. It's I was in the business for 2 years before joining Glenbrook, where I actually understood how card processing works. And actually, it was only till I got to Glenbrook and took some of the Glenbrook classes where it really locked in for me. So there's anybody who's interested in payments. Payments on Fire is a great way for them to start to acclimated to thinking about how it works.
Yeah, those are the nicest notes that I get on LinkedIn, and that is thank you so much, because I'm new and I actually listen so I can figure out what I'm supposed to do in my job, and what's going on here and how to make sense of all the stuff that's happening. So those are like just the nicest things,
Gil and I have a parallel as well. So our other podcast is Corporate Treasury 101, where we just break down treasury topics in a similar fashion almost. And I think one of the first emails we ever got when we started it, I think it must have been a year ago now, was a guy reached out to us and said, hey guys, I just wanted to say I just landed my first job as a lawyer in a treasury company that deals with, it was a treasury consultancy actually.
Yeah.
And he said, like, I had no clue what treasury was. and I just listened to all of your podcasts. I went in there and nailed the interview because I had context about what the consultancy was actually about. I knew what cash flow forecasting was. I knew what all these different terms meant. I knew at least the basics about what treasury is. And then that was enough for me as a lawyer to get the job at this firm. And it was the first email we ever got from, and it's the first time we realized humans were listening. Numbers on the screen.
To treasury. Imagine the surprise.
So it was a very warming feeling. I was like, okay, we did some good in the world.
And you guys have a great podcast, by the way. I've pointed people to your podcast because they'll ask me a treasury question. I'm like, I can answer your question, but you really should go to, like, download Payments on Fire, but the next one you want.
First in line, Payments on Fire, but then if you have a bit of time.
We love all our children, some a little more than others.
Fair.
So I did have one guy, which was like, I didn't want this to happen at all, come to me and said, I don't really actually need to take one of the Glenbrook boot camps because I've listened to all the Payments on Fire podcast. Yeah, so that's only happened once.
Did he stick around in the company very long? Or? No, he didn't stick around in the company very long. That mindset.
We don't.
Super interesting. George, you're a bit of coming back to the ROI question, right? You clearly saw the benefit to starting Payments on Fire. I mean, one is just the longevity of it, and it continued. Anything in the last 9 years, I'm sure very competitive consultancy where there's lots of priorities and partners' time is very valuable and whatnot. To keep anything going for 9 years had, of course, benefits. But also, I mean, in your new venture as well, you started another podcast. So it's almost like fresh new venture started very quickly with the new podcast as well, right alongside it.
So we started this new podcast called Making Data Better. After, as I said, my health event, I fell in with a guy named Steve Wilson from Lockstep Consulting in Australia. And, I'd been actually, even before Glenbrook, I joined Glenbrook in 2013. He and I had worked on some ideas around how do you share data in this digital world in order to accomplish online identification for fraud and risk management purposes. And Steve and I, for the last year and a half and more, have been working on a model on how we think data could be shared more efficiently and effectively and securely. We're taking if you're familiar, actually, I got a big kick out of looking at some of the early titles. We were podcasting about the FIDO Alliance and biometrics 8 years ago. And I just came from a conference in Carlsbad, California, a month or so ago, about the launch of something called passkeys, which are device-based replacements for passwords. Passwords are just awful. We're using plain text for authentication. Passkeys, now supported by Google and Meta and Apple, we have devices, and there's a device that's basically glued to our bodies all the time, right? And this device has got chipsets in it that can be used for identification, for authentication. Steve and I are positing that why don't we use the same approach for driver's licenses, for mobile numbers, for email addresses, for account numbers, and make those being presented in a device-based way, rather than letting them all out there in the world where somebody can copy and paste and use that data to defeat a synthetic identity. And there's a whole business ecosystem that needs to be in place. And so Steve is an expert in online privacy, and we think this is an important way for people to be thinking about data custodianship and provenance, and making data better. The podcast, which is on all the feeds, and makingdatabetter.com. It's completely got all the DNA from Payments on Fire. Just want to have good conversations with people to get them thinking about there has to be a better way than what we're doing now, because just here in the US, fraud losses just at the federal level are now running in the hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of a year or two. This is serious stuff. This is the wealth of individuals and countries, moving from the U.S. into the hands of organized crime and nation states that we aren't particularly friendly with. So another way of having a conversation, and the podcast is a perfect vehicle for what are basically two guys with a growing set of allies to get the word out.
Yvette, are you ready to take over at some point?
Well,
No.
Not twice.
I don't need to do it again.
No, George, you're healthy. You're healthy.
I am
You're
very
happy,
healthy.
and you're doing well. And
I'm doing great.
And I
That's
know
great.
better than to do more than two drops a month. So anyway, but yeah, no, I think it's fascinating that it kind of speaks to, there's certain things that make, and I guess this is why you're doing this podcast, this series that we're talking on right now. There's best practices around this stuff, and it's not a one size fits all, but you have to kind of know your true north and your best practices and hone them, but kind of stay true to them as you hone them. So you have a leg up going in it right from the get-go.
Experienced.
Well, I'll be calling my former colleagues and partners at Glenbrook to participate in making data better, because payments says data really matters in payments.
100%.
Well, this is kind of an interesting thing, though, too, because there is this phenomenon of people are using this medium and then they're collaborating through this medium. And you see that, I mean, this is going on YouTube. A lot of the stuff I watch on YouTube, that has absolutely nothing to do with payments, like cooking shows or something, when I want to like not think about payments, gardening, all this stuff. They'll say, I hooked up with this person who does this channel on YouTube, and I'm doing this week, and they're doing this week. And, after you watch my episode, go watch theirs to get the other side of this or whatever. And that's different in this medium, whether it's audio or audio visual, right? Yeah. This sort of creator phenomenon is sparking something that I don't think there's really an analogy to in television per se, or, blog posts were kind of an individual thing. Right?
Yeah.
There is this sort of cross-collaborative environment that's out there. It's not huge, but it's there, and it's kind of growing. I
think it's.
I don't know if you've seen that.
It's all conversations, right? So podcasting, because at its core is about conversations. Those conversations can be you with your partners in a consultancy, for example. Those conversations could be you with someone interesting, or that could be on your platform with someone else who has a platform as well, right? So because I think it's conversation orientated, and it's dialogue, right? Whereas the other mediums that you mentioned are less so. Even TV, okay, maybe you'll have a panel discussion, maybe you have a talk show or something like this. Other than that, it's typically one way. It's you with the audience, right? It's you speaking to the audience, or you showing something to the audience. Whereas a podcast is a few people having a really interesting conversation that happens to be recorded for everyone else to listen as well. I think that lends itself very easily to this collaborative effort. And I think that's from what we've seen from podcasting in general across the various podcasts we either have done ourselves or the clients with whom we manage their podcasts and whatnot, is it's just such a great networking tool in so many different ways, right? So you say it's just, we want to educate the space. You're also educating yourself by having really interesting conversations. You get access to people that maybe if you said, hey, can you just come over and have a chat in our office and have a coffee? Maybe they're not going to do that. But because you're also giving them a platform, you get to talk with some really high level people. Which maybe you wouldn't have gotten into that room in another context. So just the conversational aspect of it, yes, the platform helps, lends itself really, really nicely to this collaborative effect that you mentioned there, Yvette, I think.
How do you feel about live stream podcasting versus recorded?
Good question.
Where do you think that's going?
Yeah, so
be careful. I'm going to start interviewing you guys.
So that's the
need to make sure that
the format of this podcast is interviewing hosts. And hosts are really difficult to interview. You guys have been good.
Our rule was we can go off script at any time.
Yeah,
that's right. But I'm asking because we just did our first
okay, how did it go?
Live stream. It went pretty well.
Yeah.
But it was different.
Yeah. So it's different in a couple of ways, I think, from what we've seen, right? So a couple of things is this. One is, depends what you're optimizing for. I'm going to use engineering language here, sorry. So if it's like, hey, look, we're going to do a live stream, and then that's going to turn into a long-form content as well. We're just going to publish it because it'll be recorded, and we can just put it out.
Right.
That's fine. You still get all the benefits of podcasting, and along with some form of community in the moment. I think that's what live streaming gives you. If you want to really optimize for the live stream itself, then you have all of this hype you really need to build to make sure everyone's there at the same time. You need to do all marketing around it. You need to make people aware. You need to be putting it in front of people's faces again and again. And then on the day, people will actually turn up because they know it's happening. You need to do marketing for your marketing in that sense. Whereas with a podcast, you just publish it. You can post-market it in a much bigger way, as opposed to trying to build hype and then everything relies on that one day. So that's a little bit what makes it a bit more difficult. The engagement inside the room as well is also quite different. People are a bit more relaxed when you tell them at the start, as we always do, hey, everything can be edited. You're going to see it before it goes live. So people are a bit more relaxed. Like, I can be free. And then in post, we can tidy up and make sure I don't go to jail or get fired or whatever else. in a bit of a cancel culture that we live in or whatever else, right? So people are a bit more free. Did you find it difficult to get people to come on to do a live one versus the podcast? Or did you already have the people in mind?
We had people in mind. We were very lucky when we approached them to be on the panel. They graciously said yes, and it was wonderful. I do think we had a little bit more planning involved, and we did it. We were going to do it in person, and then we just couldn't find the right time. It does take, like, I think you'd be planning it 8-12 months out to actually do it very, very well in person. We were like 5-6 months out, and we decided it was too tight, so we did it virtually, which really opened it up. And so it was a virtual live stream. I don't know what the right term is. They were live. A webinar. It was live, yeah. But there was a little bit more of that, making sure the interview didn't go off the rails. So we were a little bit more careful because we didn't want to put anyone in a position. We kind of knew what to stay away from and what they could talk about up front. And we didn't have that luxury of the post-production editing, right? So from that angle. So it was fun. I enjoyed it, but I don't know if I'd rush to do another one. Because I don't know if I enjoy it as much as doing what we do.
Right. So. Did you take questions live, Yvette, in this webinar? Because for me, that's one of the main benefits I see of the webinar format.
Like you can engagement,
and you interact with the actual audience, whereas in a podcast, that's harder to do. Is it something you did for the webinar?
We did take questions, but we curated them a little bit.
Makes sense.
So if it was something that we knew the panelist would be okay answering, we passed it through. And if it was not, we didn't take it. We just we wrote back to the person, like we said, we're sorry, but can't take this one.
But so to your main point about we had to make sure it was within what we agreed upon in terms of structure and not going too much off rail. Personally, I think that's something we share with you, Sam. We love going off-piste. That's one of the main benefits of the podcast. I mean, for this very one, we are very far from the initial structure that we had in mind. But that's the magic of the podcast. And that's what makes it engaging. And the way we describe it, the way we describe podcasts for people who are hesitating something is like when you're defining your format, ideally, you want the audience to be listening to two friends talking about a topic they want to listen about. That's what you should be aiming for. Because then you're like achieving closeness. I'm not sure of my English here, but like you're in the person's ears. As you said, you're folding laundry. Intimate, exactly. And that's the main benefit of the podcast that we see if you want to engage and create momentum and like scale it. That's something with the webinar, which is harder to do, but you have other benefits such as the indirect engagement with the community, which is a bit of a different way to do it, but works as well. That's, I think, the main take on it.
George, do you have any insights? What's your thoughts? Do you ever consider doing it?
Live streaming?
Have you seen something happen
no.
that you thought were good?
No, actually, I would not. It feels actually constraining because
There's interesting
because you've got to say it's going to run from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific. So you got to land it at a certain amount of time. Someone's got it. Yvette, I know you were watching the clock and making sure that everybody got the right amount of coverage for those who are participating. So I love the context setting. We come to the podcast, say, here's really the vector of the topic that we're talking about. And this is going to guide the conversation to when we bring the guest in. And we want to find out what the guest's story is. There's a lot of interest in that. I've learned that, not just say, hi, welcome, Bob, and your title and let's topic. And like, how the heck did you get into payment? This is kind of those stories.
How did you land on this doorstep talking to us today about this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And sometimes the guest will say, I've never been in payments and it's my 3rd week on the job and I'm the new CFO, CTO, whatever, CPO. That's always interesting, right? And so it gives people an insight into their perspective, into the guest perspective when you do that. We started doing something where we were doing a redux after the interview. Right. That honestly we kind of got away from this year, and we just did it. Russ and I just did a recording with a payments organization called EMVCO, and we did the interview. And after we recorded, I said, "Russ, stay on. I want to do a redux here with you." And so it's really us talking about what we just heard from the guest. And that's kind of a fun thing to do. We don't do it all the time, but it can be very helpful, especially when you've heard, that your audience has just heard 10 things that need to get threaded a little bit better, or need to get put into a sequence, or this because of that kind of association, to kind of bring it up to the next level that you didn't get to in the interview for whatever reason. And it sort of gives them a sense of, oh, that's what I just heard. Oh, I see why they were talking about that, or that was important. And that's always been, or what our take was on it, right? That's it. And that's the part that George really enjoyed. What do you think about what you just heard? So that's kind of a fun thing to do.
No, it is really interesting. I think a live webinar isn't too far off a conference and attending a conference. It just means that people can do it from the comfort of their homes. I think and maybe you can a broader audience and a wider audience because of that. So I don't think it sticks true to all the benefits that we see from podcasting specifically, because I think podcasting gives you the nice middle between the scripted television show, right? So you still can get a nice storyline, just like a television show will give you, where it does require a little bit of curation, a little bit of structure, a little bit of like storytelling, right? And then actually having a coherent story, adding value in it post if you can, and like just the magic of production. Whilst staying close to the panel discussion world where you can have a free-forming conversation. It doesn't feel too scripted. I mean, it depends on the script, not format of the podcast, of course. For example, we have clients that just say, no, just make sure if we say anything stupid, cut it out, otherwise leave it as is. And others say, I want every out. And others will say, no, I want it like a real, like a TV show, like a radio show, right? And though that you can post a podcast like that as well. We tend to hold more towards the conversational side of the spectrum, but you get that feel of you're in the middle of a conversation, and you can, add a little bit of that post-production magic to it as well, to just give it that little bit of highlight, let's say. So I think,
sorry, I was like, I spent a lot of time removing my own ums and ahs.
Can relate here.
Yeah, I did.
But to your point, I just want to, Guillaume, you used the word authenticity. And, podcasting it's a rare medium where the authenticity gets communicated, right? I mean, TV, where it's all teleprompter.
Right.
As well as so much stuff. Look, there's so much bullshit out there in the world.
Let's say the things.
And human beings with different levels, and certainly my own, it moves around, have different, so we all have bullshit filters. We can all hear it when it's, and, so it's a relief to come to a medium where you get to choose. You get to discern yourself.
Right.
Decide whether, am I going to believe what I'm hearing from these folks? Is this truly valuable to me? And of course, if it's not valuable, you can just, turn it off. But you're not you're at choice as you listen to these things, and it lets us use our human instincts and human skills of finding what's relevant to us and throwing the rest aside.
Super powerful. I like
Amen.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think we can say anything more on that. That's a good.
Wrapping it up. I mean,
And on that note, all you podcasters out there,
No bullshit.
no BS.
Yeah.
Well, was it Gary Marcus? A paraphrase of this, a huge topic of conversation in my world, and I know in yours that has been in the whole world, generative AI, right? And to paraphrase Marcus, it's we now have a tool out there that can create bullshit at industrial scale at zero.
Yeah.
Exactly. We need alternatives. We need facts.
Facts. Don't get carried away, George. But yeah.
We can't have any podcast in any format without mentioning AI. Just to be clear, that's ticked. That's great. So we can continue with the rest of that. And tokenization. Do you want to do a quick tokenization? Quick reminder.
Funny that you should ask. Funny that
someone has to say AI.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. So, coming near the end, guys, I want to discuss. I really like that insight on the live webinars. Do you see any other? Because you guys have been in this game actually longer than us. Do you see any trends, changes, or whatever in the industry of podcasting in general that you find really interesting? So, live webinars is super interesting. Anything else that you would like to point out?
I think, George mentioned earlier that as to paraphrase my friend from Wales, it's cheaper than chips to get into this space, right? And I think with all of the post-production tools and recording technology and that, there's a lot more assistance to people available if they can figure out how to use it. And it allows them to get into this even faster and come across more professional. And so I think that's something that will continue, kind of picking up on the topic of AI and some of the technologies out there. I hope it stays assistive. I really hope we don't see sort of pre-manufactured podcasts from, AI-generated interviews from, where it's all derivative. I think that would be a shame, right? But from a perspective of tools and helping you learn and hone the craft a little bit more quickly, I think that's all goodness.
And maybe to link it to you, George, and to bring this to an end, anything that you've learned from POF that you're incorporating into making data better, or any stuff that you're doing now that you weren't doing with POF in terms of best practices, what you decided to keep, what you decided to do in a different manner or new? Like, what do you see being the success criteria of making data better as a podcast?
So, as I said, I'm entirely repeating the DNA that we created it with Payments on Fire, because the mission is to me, it's very similar. Let's educate, let's get the conversation going. There are fascinating people out there who have a lot to offer. Let's give them a way to and a place to say their piece. As I said, the work of creating the point of view, the preamble before you bring the guest on, that guides the discussion. That's an incredibly important activity to create a successful episode. So that's it. That's how we're approaching it.
Super interesting. Awesome. Guys, thank you so much for being on the show. That was super insightful. It was very conversational, true to podcasting as it should be.
Loved it.
Very much appreciated having you both on, especially at the same time. It's the first time we've had two people on the show at the same time. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Great to see you, Yvette.
Good to see you, George.
Thank you for listening to the B2B Podcast Stories. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please don't forget to hit subscribe and check us out at ghamarketing.com. Have a great day.